821, the raid on Etar in Ireland. The Annals of Ulster record it plain. Heathens plundered the settlement and carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not for ransom, not for mercy. The women vanish into Viking longships, and the chronicle moves on to the next raid like it counted cattle. But what happened next? Where did those women go? What system waited for a widowed queen when her city burned and her husband lay dead in the hall? You think you know, Vikings? Dragon ships. Battle axes. But there is a trade running beneath the raids that nobody wants to talk about. When a Viking force takes a city, they do not just loot silver, they inventory the women, rank them. The annals document it happening again and again across 3 centuries. Walcheren in Frisia in 837. Women and children taken. Seville in 844. 2 women from the royal harem captured. Held until the Emir of Cordoba paid to get them back. Every raid follows the pattern. Portable wealth first, women second. The system is so established that by the mid-900s, Dublin operates as one of Europe's largest slave markets, with Dalkey Island, 10 miles south, serving as a holding compound. If you value documented Viking Age history and medieval social structures like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Annals of Ulster compiled in the late 1500s by scribe Raedri O'Luanin, drawing on earlier chronicles going back to 431, cross-referenced with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Ibn Fadlan's Risala, written in 922, describing the Rus Vikings on the Volga. And the peer-reviewed study, Polygyny, Concubinage, and the Social Lives of Women in Viking Age Scandinavia, published in Viking and Medieval Scandinavia, Volume 13 in 2017, by researchers Ben Raffield, Neil Price, and Mark Collard. Now back to the information. The moment a city falls, the sorting begins. High-status women face a calculation. A widowed queen has value in 3 ways. Ransom value if her family still holds territory. Political value if marriage to her legitimizes a claim. And trade value in the slave networks stretching from Dublin to the Caspian Sea. The decision gets made fast. In 922, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling as a diplomat for the Caliph of Baghdad, reaches the Volga River and encounters Rus traders, Swedish origin, Viking ideals. He watches them for months and writes it down. 400 warriors attend a king. Each warrior has a slave girl who washes his head and prepares his food. Each warrior has another slave girl who serves as his concubine. 40 more girls sit with the king himself, destined for his bed. This is not decoration, this is infrastructure. The polygyny system demands a constant inflow of women because wealthy men take multiple wives and concubines, which creates a shortage of available women for common men. Anthropological studies show this pattern increases male competition and drives risk-taking behavior. Young men without access to marriage become the raiding crews. They need wealth to afford bride price payments. They need captives to supply the slave markets that feed the whole system. The Life of Findan, written in the 9th century, describes an aristocratic woman, sister of the noble Leinsterman Findan, taken captive by a Viking group in Ireland and held for ransom. She gets her name recorded because she has a brother with status. But the same chronicle describes Findan himself captured and sold as a slave to a nunnery in Northumbria. After causing trouble, there he gets expelled and cast adrift in a boat without oars as punishment. Vikings rescue him. They take him to Germany and sell him to a widow who paid with counterfeit money. He eventually gets home. Most do not. The thousands of Irish slaves taken in the raids between 795 and the early 900s do not get chronicles. They get absorbed into the system. The women especially. Analysis of genetic data from Iceland and the Western Isles shows that Viking settlements were established mainly by male Vikings who mated with women from local populations. The founding population of Iceland included Irish and British women. Whether they came voluntarily or were taken by force, the DNA does not say. But the Annals of Ulster tell the story. 840, long forts, fortified encampments, start appearing on the Irish coast, Dublin, Lynn, Duachel. These are not just military camps, they are production centers. Archaeological evidence from the Viking site at Torksey in England and Scandinavian sites like Sanda in Sweden suggests that some encampments functioned as plantations with slave labor producing textiles. Textile working in Scandinavia associates strongly with women. A Swedish site at Sanda shows a great hall surrounded by small houses. Some archaeologists now interpret this as a slave-driven production facility. The cloth for the sails on hundreds of ships had to come from somewhere. Someone had to make it. And when you're running a maritime empire with fleets of hundreds of ships as chronicled in the 9th century, you need a labor force. But what happens to a queen, specifically when her city falls? She enters one of 3 tracks. Track 1, immediate ransom. If her family has wealth and territory, they negotiate fast. In 844, after Vikings raid Seville and take captives, including 2 royal women, those women get returned when the emir pays. The payment happens in a formal ceremony with official witnesses. This creates documentation, but it also creates a market. The Vikings learn exactly what a royal captive is worth in silver weight. Track 2, political marriage. If a Viking leader wants to legitimize control over conquered territory, he marries into the local royal family. This happens repeatedly across the Viking Age. Gunhild, mother of King's wife of Eric Bloodaxe, serves as Queen of Norway, then Orkney, then Northumbria, as her husband gets driven from throne to throne between 930 and 954. When Eric dies at the Battle of Stainmore in 954, sources disagree on Gunhild's fate. One saga claims she was left to her fate when Eric died. Another says she fled to Denmark. The uncertainty tells you what happened to women whose political utility ended. They vanish from the record. Track 3. The slave markets. Dublin is the hub. References to slave trading in written records and material evidence suggest it was one of the most important economic activities in Dublin during the 9th and 10th centuries. The settlement grows around this trade. By the end of the 10th century, Dublin has a regular street pattern, manufacturing, and integration into long-distance trade networks. The Annals of the Four Masters describe how in 938, an Irish abbot was drowned at Dalkey Island while trying to escape captivity with the treasures of his church. Dalkey served as a holding compound. Captives wait there while buyers come to assess them. From Dublin, the trade routes run east. The Volga trade route connects Scandinavia to the Islamic world. People taken captive during Viking raids across Eastern Europe get sold to Moorish Spain via Dublin, or transported to Hedeby or Brno, and from there via the Volga to present-day Russia. Slavic slaves and furs get traded to Muslim merchants in exchange for Arab silver dirham and silk. These goods show up in archaeological finds at Birkawallen and Dublin. Initially, the route passes through the Khazar Khaganate, but from the early 10th century onward, it goes via Volga, Bulgaria, and then by caravan to Khwarazm to the Samanid slave markets in Central Asia, and finally via Iran to the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, where there is great demand for slave girls as concubines. High-status women command higher prices, but face the same fate. Concubinage. Ibn Fadlan observes the Rus and notes their practices without emotion. He describes them as having bodies as tall as palm trees, perfect physical specimens, but he also calls them the filthiest of God's creatures. They do not clean themselves after sex or defecation. They share a communal bowl for washing, where each man empties the contents of his nose and throat into the water before passing it to the next person. This is the world a captured queen enters if she goes through the eastern trade route. A study published in 2017 titled Polygyny, Concubinage, and the Social Lives of Women in Viking Age Scandinavia analyzes the evidence and finds that polygyny and concubinage are clearly recorded among the Rus by 10th century Arab travelers. The system creates an operational sex ratio imbalance. Too many men, not enough available women. This drives crime rates. Research shows that polygynous societies see increased rates of theft, rape, murder, kidnapping of women, sexual slavery, prostitution, gender inequality, intra-household conflict, and domestic abuse. The percentage of married men in the population determines the rates of crime and social disruption. The authors propose that this imbalance in late Iron Age Scandinavian societies may have contributed to the first Viking raids. Young men could not afford bride price payments, so they raided to get wealth and captives. A widowed queen stripped of her status becomes a commodity. Her value depends on age, appearance, and fertility. The same study notes that while men are most frequently cited as targets for high status ransom, women were specifically targeted for their roles in craft production and as wives and concubines. Archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletal remains of presumed Viking era slaves found in graves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark show signs of abuse and decapitation. Anna Kellström of Stockholm University examined the remains. Some bodies show filed teeth. Dental grooves appear on Viking Age skeletons in Sweden, Denmark, and England. For decades, researchers assumed this was a warrior practice. New analysis questions that it may mark slaves. The bodies lack grave goods. They get thrown into pits. Multiple individuals in single graves. No ceremony. In some cases, they are clearly sacrificial victims buried with their masters. Ibn Fadlan documents this in detail. When a wealthy Rus chieftain dies, his family asks his slave girls and slave boys, "Which one of you will die with him?" One answers. Once she says yes, she cannot back out. She is no longer free even if she wishes to change her mind. For the next 10 days, while the chieftain lies in a temporary grave and funeral clothes are sewn, the volunteer slave girl gets elevated status. She wears beautiful clothes. She drinks constantly, and she is forced to have sex with the dead chieftain's male followers. Each man gives her the same message: "Tell our master we did this out of love for him." Ibn Falan watches the preparations. The chieftain's ship gets dragged onto land. A bed of silks is prepared. The dead man is exhumed, dressed, and placed on the bed surrounded by weapons, mead, fruit, and meat. Then the sacrifices begin. A dog cut in half, 2 horses, 2 cows, a rooster, a hen, all split and placed in the ship. On the final day, the slave girl goes through a ritual. She is lifted over an empty doorframe 3 times. She says she sees her master in the afterlife. She is given a chicken. She rips its head off and throws the body into the ship. Then she is led onto the vessel. 6 men and an old woman Ibn Fadlan calls the angel of death enter the ship's pavilion. The girl has been drinking all day. She is visibly confused. She cannot enter the pavilion on her own. Her head must be guided through the entrance. Inside there is more sex. 2 men hold her feet. 2 hold her hands. The angel of death places a rope around her neck. As the old woman strangles her with the cord, another person stabs her repeatedly between the ribs. Outside the ship, the men bang shields with sticks to drown out her cries, so other slave girls will not be frightened and try to escape. When she is dead, her body is placed next to the chieftain. A male relative of the dead man walks backward naked, carrying a burning piece of wood. He lights the ship. The wind picks up and the flames consume everything. Afterward, the Russ build a mound over the ashes and carve the chieftain's name on a post. This is what volunteer means in a slave's world. It means you have no choice. The pattern appears across the Viking world. At Repton in England, the Great Heathen Army overwinters in 873 to 874. Archaeological excavations reveal a mass burial near the church. At least 264 individuals, mostly men aged 18 to 45, warriors. But mixed among them are women and children. Some show evidence of violent death. One skeleton belongs to a woman who was buried with a Viking sword and other weapons. Analysis suggests she may have been killed as part of a burial ritual. The Repton burial sits at a crossroads moment. The Great Heathen Army arrived in 865, led by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. They conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia. They took York in 867. When the Northumbrian leaders, King Osbert and the usurper Ella, tried to retake the city, both were killed in battle on the 21st of March, 867. York becomes Jorvik, capital of Viking Northumbria. The puppet king Expert gets installed. In 872, when the great army is elsewhere, local Northumbrians drive out the Viking-backed rulers. The Vikings regain control in 873. Halfdan returns and is proclaimed King of Northumbria, though he only really rules southern Northumbria, which becomes known as the Kingdom of York. In 875 or 876, Halfdan divides the land among his men who plow it and support themselves. This is the Danelaw. Former kingdoms now parceled out as farmland. What happened to the royal women of Northumbria? The sources do not say King Osbert is dead. Ella is dead. Their families vanish from the chronicles. But the pattern from Ireland tells the story. When Amlaib and Eamar ruled Dublin in 871, the Annals of Ulster call Eamar king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. These are not isolated raids anymore. This is territorial control. And territorial control requires managing the existing population. Women of the conquered royal families face the same choices. Ransom, if anyone can pay. Marriage, if it serves Viking political interests. Or absorption into the slave system. The silence in the chronicles suggests what happened. Highborn women who lose their protectors lose their status. They become invisible. The records track kings and battles and property transfers. They do not track a widow's descent from queen consort to concubine to an unmarked grave in a foreign land. But we have DNA evidence. Genetic studies of populations in the Western Isles and Isle of Skye show Viking settlements were established mainly by male Vikings who mated with women from local populations. The male lineages traced back to Scandinavia. The female lineages traced to the British Isles. This is not mutual cultural exchange. This is asymmetric colonization. Men arrive with weapons. Women are already there. The sagas romanticize this. They describe shield maidens and powerful queens. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. The Burka warrior grave discovered in Sweden and analyzed in 2017 initially was assumed to be male because it contained weapons, a strategy board game indicating tactical knowledge and a warhorse. DNA analysis revealed the skeleton was female. This caused celebration. A woman warrior, but look closer. She is one skeleton in one grave. The thousands of other women in Viking Age graves cluster around a different pattern. Textile tools, household goods, and evidence of hard labor. Skeletal analysis shows repetitive strain injuries consistent with textile production and food processing. Many show signs of nutritional stress during childhood. These are not elite women. These are the labor force. In 922, when Ibn Fadlan describes the Rus king attended by 400 warriors each with 2 slave girls, one for domestic work and one for sex, he is describing a system that requires a continual supply of captive women to function. Where do those women come from? The raids. 821 at Etar, 840 on sites across Ireland, 865 with the Great Heathen Army in England. Every campaign documents captive taking. The numbers scale up. Early raids might take dozens. By the mid-9th century, fleets are recorded taking hundreds, potentially thousands, in coordinated ventures. The Annals of Ulster in 866 record that Viking forces took large numbers of prisoners from Ireland. In 873, the Annals of Fulda describe a Viking force operating in Frisia, threatening to take women and children captive if locals do not provide tribute. This is systematic. This is economic infrastructure, and it shapes everything else. The need for captive labor helps explain the scale of Viking expansion. The first wave of raids in the 790s targets monasteries for gold and silver, but by the 820s, the raids shift focus. They start targeting population centers. They establish permanent bases. The long forts in Ireland function as collection points where captives can be processed before transport to markets. Dublin grows from a temporary raiding camp into one of Europe's most important trade cities by the late 10th century precisely because it sits at the center of these networks. Goods flow through. So do people. An Irish abbot drowning in 938 while trying to escape from Dalkey Island is not an isolated incident. It is evidence of a functioning system of captivity. Royal women caught in this system face distinct horrors. A common woman taken captive might vanish into textile production or agricultural labor. She becomes anonymous. But a queen or princess has a face. She has a name. When she gets sold or forced into concubinage, the transaction is political. In 952, Eric Bloodaxe and his queen Gunhild rule York. Contemporary sagas present Gunhild as a powerful sorceress who advises her husband and pursues vendettas against her enemies. But look at her trajectory. She marries Eric when he is crowned Prince of Norway. They have 7 sons. Eric becomes king around 930, then gets driven out by his half-brother, Håkon, in 934. The family flees to Orkney. Later, they receive an invitation to rule Northumbria. The sources are murky on who invited them. Some say King Ethelstan, though this seems unlikely since Ethelstan fostered Håkon and sent him back to claim the Norwegian throne. Others say Wulstan, Bishop of York, invited them. Regardless, Eric and Gunhild arrive in Northumbria and rule York starting around 948 or 950. They get baptized into Christianity. The family tries to hold on to power, but York is contested territory. Anglo-Saxon kings won it. Irish, Norse kings from Dublin won it. In 954, Eric leaves York during a political crisis. He becomes what the chronicles call a scourge, raiding up and down the coast until the English kill him at the Battle of Stainmore. What happens to Gunhild after this? One saga says she fled to Denmark. Another suggests she was left to her fate, implying she fell into the hands of her enemies. The sagas written centuries later present her as a witch who survived through cunning and magic. But the sagas also describe her origin story. In one version, she is the daughter of Gorm, the old king of Denmark. In another version, she was a captive in Finnmark held by 2 wizards who wanted to marry her. Eric finds her, convinces her to help him kill the wizards, and then marries her. Whether this story is true does not matter. What matters is that it shows how easily a woman of high status can slide between categories: princess, captive, sorceress, queen, widow, refugee. The sagas preserve her because she was Eric's wife. But they preserve her in fragments and contradictions because ultimately her story does not matter to the saga writers the way her husband's does. When Eric dies, Gunhild falls out of the narrative. The chronicles stop tracking her. She becomes another woman whose fate is implied by silence. This happens to other royal women. The historical record preserves their names when they are useful to men. Ingrid, Ragnvald's daughter, becomes queen consort of Norway when she marries Harald Gille. She likely resides in Nidaros, which is modern Trondheim. When Harold is assassinated in 1136, Ingrid is widowed the first time. She remarries twice more. Each time her new husband dies. 3 widowhoods. She continues as an advisor to her sons, especially King Inge, during the early stages of the Norwegian Civil War era. Inge dies in battle in 1161. Ingrid goes into exile in Denmark. The last record of her dates to the early 1160s. Then she vanishes from history. 3 husbands dead, 2 sons kings, decades of political influence, and her story ends with exile and silence. The sources call her important because her sons were kings, but when those sons die, there is no more reason to track her. She falls through the cracks. The pattern repeats. Elisiv of Kiev marries Harald Hardrada, who becomes king of Norway in 1046. When Harold is killed at Stamford Bridge in 1066, trying to invade England, Elisiv disappears from the sources. We know one of her daughters married into Danish and Swedish royalty. We know nothing else. Sigrid, the haughty widow of Swedish King Eric the Victorious, inherits considerable land and power. When her son ascends to the throne, she begins receiving marriage offers from men interested in her inheritance, not her. Sigrid responds by having two suitors, Harold, her foster brother, and Visivald of Garderic, burned to death in her great hall after a feast. She executes them publicly to send a message. The sagas preserve this because it is dramatic. But it also shows what a widowed queen must do to maintain autonomy. She must be willing to murder potential husbands who see her as a route to power, and even then the sagas portray her as arrogant and vengeful, rather than as a woman defending herself. These are the women whose names survive because they had wealth and agency. But what about the ones who did not? The Annals of Ulster document the captivity of women at Atar in 821. How many of those women were wives of local lords or chieftains? How many were widows whose husbands died defending the settlement? The Chronicle does not distinguish, it just notes a great number of women. They disappear into the slave routes. Some might have been ransomed, but ransom requires someone willing and able to pay. A widow without living family has no one to negotiate for her. She becomes another anonymous captive processed through the Dublin slave market or shipped east along the Volga route. If you value documented research on Viking Age social structures like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. Now back to the information. The physical evidence of the system appears in burial grounds. Excavations at mass graves associated with Viking activity show mixed populations. Warriors, yes, but also women and children. Some bodies show trauma consistent with violent death. Others show no trauma, but were buried without goods, suggesting low status. At sites like Repton, where the great heathen army overwintered the mass, burial contains people who do not fit the warrior profile. Women aged 20 to 40, subadults. These individuals were not part of the army, they were part of the baggage train. When the army moved, it brought captives along for labor and other purposes. When people died during the winter, they went into communal graves. No ceremony. No individual identity. The earth swallows them and the chronicles move on. This is the mechanics of what happened to widowed queens and high-status women when Vikings took their cities. They entered a sorting system that operated on economic logic. First, the calculation of ransom value. Can her family pay? If yes, negotiate fast, get silverweight, document the transaction. If no, move to step 2, political value. Can marriage to her legitimize a claim to territory? If yes, marry her off, use her bloodline to create continuity. If no, move to step 3, the slave markets. Age, appearance, skills, fertility. These factors determine price. A widowed queen in her 20s with no family backing becomes a high-value concubine in the Eastern trade. A widowed queen in her 40s with no connections becomes textile labor. Either way, she disappears from the chronicles because chronicles track power and property, not the lives of women who lost both. The system was so embedded in Viking Age economics that when Alfred the Great finally defeats the great heathen army at the Battle of Edington, in 878, one of the terms of the subsequent treaty is the creation of the Danelaw. Viking-controlled territory in northern and eastern England, the treaty partitions the island, but it does not address what happened to the people living in those territories before the partition. Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, and parts of Mercia fell to the Vikings between 865 and 878. The royal families of those kingdoms were killed or displaced. What happened to the women of those families? Some probably fled to Wessex with King Alfred. Others had no means to flee. They became part of the territorial transfer. When Halfdan divides Northumbrian land among his men in 876, the land includes the people living on it. Former free women attached to estates become unfree. Their status collapses because the men who define that status are dead. This is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. When a kingdom falls, the men fight and die. The women survive, and their survival looks like betrayal to later chroniclers who are men. A widow who marries a Viking to protect herself and her children becomes a collaborator in the narratives. A captive woman who becomes a concubine gets erased from the record entirely because acknowledging her existence means acknowledging what the conquerors did. So the chronicles mention raids. They mention captive taking in general terms. They do not follow the captives. They do not track what happened after the ship sailed away. The closest we get is Ibn Fadlan's account, and he is describing Rus Vikings on the Volga, 1,000 miles from Dublin. But the account reveals the structure. The 400 warriors each, with 2 slave girls, the king with 40 more. This is not Scandinavian in origin. This is a system the Rus adopted or adapted from cultures they encountered in the East. But it shows what Viking Age society did with captive women when they had the power to organize on this scale. Archaeological evidence from Dublin and Hedeby and Burqa reveals trade goods from across the known world: Arab silver from the Abbasid Caliphate, silks from China, furs from the north, amber from the Baltic. These items moved along the same routes as captives. The Volga trade route was not just about luxury goods, it was about human cargo. Slavic slaves gave the word slave to European languages. The trade was so significant that it shaped linguistic development. When we say slave in English, we are echoing the thousands of Slavic people trafficked south through Viking-controlled rivers into the Islamic world between the 8th and 11th centuries. And mixed among those thousands were the high-born women of conquered territories: Irish, English, Pictish, Frankish. Their names are lost, but their DNA survives in modern populations, showing the mixing that occurred. The Dublin market operated for over 200 years. It did not happen by accident. It required infrastructure, holding facilities like Dalkey Island, ships capable of transporting people, routes to markets in other regions, and a legal framework that allowed the trade to continue. Viking Age law codes mentioned slaves. The Grágás, an Icelandic legal text compiled in the 12th century but reflecting earlier practices, states that a man was entitled to own slaves and that slaves had almost no legal rights. They could not own property. They could not testify in court. A master could kill a slave with relatively few consequences. These laws did not just appear in Iceland, they reflect common practices across Viking Age Scandinavia. When a Viking leader conquers a territory, he brings this legal framework with him. A queen who loses her kingdom loses her legal personhood. She becomes property. The skeletal evidence at burial sites supports this. Bodies buried without grave goods. Bodies showing signs of malnutrition during life. Bodies with healed fractures suggesting repeated injury. Bodies with filed teeth, which may indicate servile status. And bodies of women buried in positions suggesting they were killed to accompany male burials. Not all of these bodies are captives from raids. Some were born into slavery, but the raids replenished the slave population. Every campaign brought fresh captives into the system. Some were children who would be raised as slaves. Some were adults who would work until they died. And some were high-status women whose value lay in their bloodlines, or their bodies, or both. Ibn Fadlan's account describes what happens when a high-status slave dies with her master. But what about the ones who do not die? The ones who survive years as concubines? No chronicle tracks them. The sagas occasionally mention freed slaves who rise to prominence, but these stories are rare and focus on men. A male slave can earn freedom through exceptional service, or by saving enough money to buy himself. A female slave held as a concubine has fewer paths to freedom. Her children by her master might have some status, but she remains a slave unless the master formally frees her. And even freedom does not restore status. A freed slave is still marked. Former slaves face barriers to marriage, property ownership, and legal standing. A widowed queen who becomes a concubine and later gains freedom does not become a queen again. She becomes a freed woman with a past that follows her. The genetic legacy tells the end of the story. Studies of Icelandic populations reveal that the founding settlers came from Scandinavia but brought women from the British Isles. The male lineages are Norse, the female lineages are Celtic. This pattern appears across Viking-settled territories: the Western Isles, Orkney, Shetland, Isle of Man. These places show the same genetic signature: Scandinavian men, local women. The mixing was not peaceful cultural exchange. It was conquest followed by the systematic integration of conquered populations through marriage and concubinage. When the genetic evidence says Viking men mated with local women, it is using neutral language to describe what the chronicles call captivity. The final piece of evidence comes from the archaeological record at Dublin. Excavations in the 1960s and 1970s revealed a wealth of material from the Norse period: trade goods, workshops, evidence of manufacturing, and also evidence of habitation, small structures clustered around larger halls. The layout suggests social stratification. Elite residences with attached dependencies. The dependencies likely housed slaves and lower status workers. This is the infrastructure of the slave economy. You cannot run a major trade city without housing and feeding the labor force. The small structures at Dublin are where that labor force lived. Some of the people in those structures were born free in Ireland and captured during raids. Some were born into slavery in Dublin itself, the children of earlier captives. The system perpetuated itself across generations. And what about the widowed queens, the ones whose names we know? The Gunhild, wife of Eric Bloodaxe, vanishes after 954. Ingrid Ragnvald's daughter goes into exile after 1161. Elisiv of Kiev disappears after 1066. The pattern is consistent. When their utility ends, their stories stop. The chronicles preserve them as long as they are politically relevant: queen consort, advisor to kings, mother of heirs. But once those roles end, there is no reason to keep tracking them. They either die in obscurity or they remarry and the cycle begins again. another husband, another kingdom, another risk of widowhood. Each time the risk increases, because each time they have less family backing and less political capital. This is what happened to widowed queens after Vikings took their cities. Some were ransomed if their families had wealth and leverage. Some were married off to legitimize Viking rule, and the rest entered the slave system that stretched from Dublin to the Caspian Sea. They became concubines in Rus territories along the Volga. They became textile workers in Scandinavian production sites. They became sacrificial victims in funeral rituals when their masters died. Their status collapsed from royalty to property in the span of a single raid. The chronicles note their capture in general terms. The annals say a great number of women carried into captivity, but they do not follow those women. They do not record the years spent in servitude. They do not document the children born to captive mothers who would never know their mothers or original status. The silence in the sources is the evidence. When women disappear from the chronicles, we know what happened. We know from Ibn Fadlan's detailed account of funeral practices. We know from genetic studies showing Scandinavian men mixing with Celtic women. We know from archaeological evidence of slave labor at production sites. We know from the laws that stripped slaves of legal personhood. We know from the trade routes that move people alongside amber and silver. We know from the mass graves that hold bodies without ceremony or grave goods. The system was comprehensive. It was organized. It was economically essential to Viking age expansion, and it consumed thousands of women across 3 centuries. A queen who lost her husband and her city did not just lose her throne, she lost her legal status. She lost her name in the chronicles. She lost her children who would be raised in a different culture. She lost her language as she was forced to speak the language of her captors. She lost her religion as she was forced to participate in pagan rituals or convert to Christianity under Viking kings who adopted the faith for political reasons. She lost her past because no one would write it down. And she lost her future because even if she survived, she would never regain what she lost. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 793 to 1066, almost 300 years. During that time, tens of thousands of people were taken captive and processed through the slave systems that supported Viking expansion. The number is impossible to calculate precisely because the sources rarely give numbers, but we can estimate from the scale of raids. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 had thousands of warriors. Each raiding campaign lasted months or years. Each campaign targeted multiple population centers. The annals document raids happening annually across Ireland in the 9th century. Each raid took captives. If each raid took dozens, and there were dozens of raids per year across multiple theaters, then the total count reaches into the tens of thousands easily. Among those tens of thousands were widowed queens and high-status women who had names and positions before the raids. After the raids, they became anonymous captives processed through markets or held as concubines or killed as part of funeral rituals. Their stories ended not with a chronicle entry, but with silence. The absence of records is the record. When the annals note that Etar was plundered in 821 and a great number of women carried off, and then the next entry describes a different raid, we are supposed to understand what happened to those women. The chroniclers knew. The readers knew. Everyone living in that world knew what carried off meant. It meant a widowed queen waking up in a longship surrounded by armed men who speak a language she does not know, heading to a market where she will be sold. It meant standing on a platform while buyers examine her teeth and feel her arms to assess her capacity for work. It meant being purchased by a trader who takes her east along the Volga, where she will never see Ireland or England again. It meant becoming one of 400 slave girls attending warriors in a Rus camp, where her job is to wash hair and serve food and submit to her owner whenever he demands. It meant watching other slaves volunteer to die with masters, knowing that refusing to volunteer makes survival worse. It meant bearing children who would be born into slavery because the children of slaves are slaves. It meant years of labor until her body broke and she became too old or too sick to be useful, at which point she would be discarded. Or it meant something worse. It meant being chosen as the volunteer when a wealthy master died. It meant 10 days of elevated status drinking, feasting, wearing fine clothes while knowing what was coming at the end. It meant being passed among the dead man's warriors, with each one taking his turn and giving her messages to carry to the afterlife. It meant being drugged on the final day, unable to walk straight, unable to think clearly, being guided onto the ship where 6 men and an old woman waited. It meant being held down by 4 men while a rope closed around the throat and a blade entered between the ribs again and again. It meant dying in terror while men outside banged shields to cover the sounds. It meant being burned with the master and having a mound raised over the ashes with his name carved on a post, but no one carving her name because slaves do not get names in death any more than they do in life. This was the reality for widowed queens when Vikings took their cities. A queen is just a woman whose status depends entirely on male protection. When that protection dies, her status dies with it, unless she has family who can ransom her or political value that makes her worth marrying. If she has neither, she enters the slave system. And the slave system was worse than death. Death was quick. The system was years of degradation followed by an anonymous grave or a funeral pyre where someone else's name got carved. The chronicles do not dwell on this because it was common knowledge. Everyone in the Viking Age knew what happened to captive women. The sources only note it when something unusual occurs. A bishop ransomed, a royal woman returned to her family. The routine horror did not need documentation because it was routine. In 2022, archaeologist Anna Kellström published analysis of skeletal remains from presumed Viking-era slaves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The bones showed signs of abuse, healed fractures indicating repeated injury, nutritional deficiencies suggesting inadequate food, dental modifications that may mark servile status, and some remains showed evidence of decapitation. These bodies came from graves lacking the goods usually found in Viking burials. No weapons, no jewelry, no personal items. Just bodies in the ground, sometimes multiple bodies in a single grave. One grave at a Swedish site held 40 people. 40. No names, no memorial, just a pit filled with the dead who were not considered worth individual burial. Among those 40 bodies, or others like them at similar sites, could be women taken in raids decades earlier. A queen captured at Etar in 821 would be in her 40s or 50s by the time the great heathen army invaded England in 865. She might have spent those decades in Scandinavia producing textiles in a slave-driven workshop. When she died, her body would go into a common grave with other slaves. No one would remember she had once been high-born. No chronicle would note her passing. She would become one more skeleton in one more mass burial discovered by archaeologists 1,000 years later, who would analyze her bones for evidence of hard labor and poor nutrition, but would never know she once wore fine clothes and sat in a hall and had a husband and maybe children before the Vikings came. The final evidence is what did not happen. No chronicles describe Viking Age programs to protect widows. No laws require that captive royal women be treated humanely. No treaties specify that high-status prisoners must be ransomed rather than enslaved. The absence of these protections tells us that captive women had no rights worth protecting. They were spoils of war, economic assets. When Viking leaders negotiated treaties with Anglo-Saxon kings, the terms covered land and tribute and political arrangements. They did not cover the return of captive women because captive women were not considered important enough to negotiate over. A king might pay ransom for a bishop or a male noble, but women, unless they were queens with substantial political value, were simply absorbed into the Viking economy. This is the system that operated for 3 centuries across northern Europe. It shaped the demographic makeup of Iceland and the Scottish Islands. It drove the economics of Dublin and Hedeby and Birka. It motivated raids that brought portable wealth and human cargo. It created the operational sex ratio imbalances that fueled more raiding as young men without access to marriage partners sought wealth and captives. It was comprehensive, organized, brutal, and economically rational. And it consumed thousands of women, including widowed queens who lost everything when their cities fell. In 922, when Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled to the Volga and observed the Rus Vikings, he was witnessing one endpoint of the system. The Rus had access to captives from raids and trade networks stretching across Eastern Europe. They organized those captives into a hierarchy of use, 400 warriors each with 2 slave girls, a king with 40 more. This was not exceptional. This was how successful Viking Age leaders organized their households, and every woman in that system came from somewhere. She had a life before captivity. Some were born slaves, but many were captured. And among the captured were women who once held status. Women whose husbands were lords or chieftains, women whose fathers controlled territory, women who expected to live their lives as free people. One raid changed everything. A widowed queen at Etar in 821, who survived the next 4 decades, might have ended up in a mass grave in Sweden in the 860s. Or she might have died in Dublin, or along the Volga, or at a funeral pyre in Rus territory. The location does not matter. What matters is that she disappeared. Her name left the chronicles. Her story ended. And worse than death was a system that kept her alive for decades of servitude before finally discarding her when she was no longer useful. That was the fate of widowed queens after Vikings took their cities. Not a quick death in battle, not a ransoming home, but a slow erasure, status to captivity to labor to an unmarked grave. The chronicles move on to the next raid, the system continues, and the women disappear one by one into silence.